The rain came down like judgment, hard, cold, and with no mercy. It lacquered the city in a slick of neon and reflection, turning the courthouse steps into a black mirror that swallowed shoes and names. Mara Valen stood beneath the awning, collar up, hands jammed into the pockets of a coat that had seen too many winters. She watched people pass, umbrellas like tiny flags in the storm, faces hollowed by work and worry. She had long ago learned that the courthouse was where people's facades fell away. Today, more than ever, she felt her own slipping. If you asked somebody what Mara was before the trial started, before the discovery of the ledger, before the threats and the phone calls, most would say she was precise. Law is arithmetic for the moral heart, careful addition, relentless subtraction. She'd built her reputation on that, sharp angles and cold facts. A former assistant district attorney turned defense attorney after a mistake that tasted like betrayal. Back when she prosecuted, she put away a man on circumstantial evidence because the file was tidy and the mayor wanted a win. The man later wrote to her from prison, claiming he'd been framed. His letters, thin and pleading, arrived the week after her wedding fell apart. She broke the law's tidy equation then. She burned the prosecutorial file in a sink of whiskey and ash and quietly resigned. That secret, her first dirty ledger, would eventually shape everything. Now, a new case had landed at her door like a living thing. It was simple on paper and messy in life. Her client, Jonah Reed, 26, a barista with a talent for latte art and bad teeth, stood accused of the homicide of Eleanor Park, philanthropist, board president of the Mercy Foundation, and a public face of goodness with a private ledger of wounds. Eleanor had been found dead in her townhouse, throat cut, a single red bookmark placed across her chest like a judge's scrawl. Jonah claimed he'd left the cafe early that night, exhausted after a double shift. The security footage from the street showed him taking a left where the townhouse stood 3 blocks off. He had no alibi, no motive, and the city was hungry for a headline, "Coffee Boy Kills Saint." But Mara saw things others didn't. The footage was grainy, the timestamp blurred, and Jonah, when he spoke to her, had a look Mara recognized, the same desperate honesty she had read in the prison letters years ago. She took the case because she believed that a wronged person deserved a fighter, and because the Crown prosecutor assigned, Presidential Court, was James Harker, her old mentor. Harker had pulled her from the DA's bullpen years before, molded her into a prosecutorial machine, and then, inexplicably, protected the mayor's interests when the dossier on the framed man had been handed up the chain. Their falling out had been clean and private, no fistfights, only the slow frost of avoidance. But Mara still carried a map of Harker's voice in her head. Low, patient, always justifying. Now he stood across the courtroom, like a silhouette from her old life, and the trial's opening statements were a drumbeat to the past. The case unfolded like a hand of cards being dealt by a dealer who kept one palm turned. The prosecution's story was neat. Eleanor Park had been an untouchable philanthropist, with enemies hidden under the veneer. Jonah, young and resentful of the upper crust he served lattes to, snapped. The evidence. Prints on the knife, a sock found with fibers matching Jonah's jacket, and the CCTV that placed him near the scene. Yet there were anomalies, small, precise, and Mara's specialty. The print patterns had smudges inconsistent with the cut. The fibers in the sock included a thread color only used in luxury suits, not Jonah's jacket, and the CCTV's left angle was obstructed at the crucial second. Mara's investigation pulled her into Eleanor's life. A network of board members, a private donor list, late-night charities that read like obituaries for their benefactors' secrets. Eleanor had used people the way a gardener uses soil, discarding, composting, planting anew. But the ledger, what had summoned Jonah into the courthouse like a moth to a flame, was a ledger hidden in plain sight. Donations and thank yous that lined up with disappearances. People had vanished after crossing Eleanor's path, and when Mara pushed, she found a pattern of settlements silenced by the Mercy Foundation's legal team. And at the center of that web was a name Mara had not expected, James Harker. Not as a donor, but as a trustee, sitting in the shade while the foundation pruned the city's weaker branches. Harker's presence made the trial a furnace. During cross-examination, Mara watched him watch her, their shared history, skating across his face in microseconds. The mentor who had taught her to read a man's arbitration as like reading a ledger, where the public entry masks the private debt. When she confronted him with a paper trail connecting him to shadow donations, he smiled with the kind of calm that was a threat. He told the court in a voice soft as courtroom lights that Eleanor had been a woman judged by her generosity and that Jonah Reed was a violent, entitled stranger. He believed, fiercely and plainly, that the law existed to maintain order, even if the order required cleaner hands in private. The first twist came on a Tuesday. Mara received an anonymous envelope slid under her office door, a single photograph and a note. The photograph showed Eleanor leaving a small, nondescript clinic 3 nights before her death, her face pale but resolute. The note read, "Mercy for some, mercy bought for others." Inside the clinic's records, she found a file labeled with Eleanor's initials and a list of names, people from the Foundation's successful rehabilitation roster who had vanished months later. One name, circled in ink, faint with age, matched the man Mara had helped in prison years ago, the one whose file had been burned in whiskey. He'd been on Eleanor's counsel, a clandestine consultant whose findings had been used to silence dissent. Mara's hands went cold. It was one thing to prosecute without looking, another to become the cover-up. The ledger wasn't only Eleanor's, it was Harker's ledger too. The city's philanthropic machine functioned like a clean city, but the dirty work, settlement, hush money, legal erasure, was outsourced to men with robes and notepads. Mara had been complicit once. The realization settled like a stone in her boot. She could have stepped back. That would have been sensible and safe. Instead, she did the thing she had never been able to do before. She pursued the truth straight toward the flame. Her second twist arrived with a confession. Jonah, in a private conversation late in the night, told Mara something she had not expected. He had been hired by a person named Lennox to get Eleanor's attention. The plan, a foolish, pathetic lie, was to stage an argument outside her house so she would come out and stop Jonah from making a scene, a way to ingratiate himself in front of the Foundation and earn a bartender's chance for a stipend. He had never planned murder. The knife had been in Eleanor's kitchen years ago, he said, a domestic remnant found under a sink, and the red bookmark. Eleanor had collected matching bookmarks like a hobby, could be placed by anyone who wanted to send a message. Mara dug into the Lennox lead. The trail twisted through a private security firm linked to the Foundation and then into a string of offshore accounts. Every lead spiraled back toward the Mercy Foundation's inner ring. When she pressed Harker in the corridors, he warned her with that same low voice. Some truths belong to the learning of sleep. He believed truly that peace required shadows. Mara believed otherwise, yet she had been sleeping on similar pillows for years. The trial turned into a battleground of ethics. The prosecution introduced a new witness, a man who claimed Jonah had confessed in the alley behind the cafe. The defendant's door, a battered thing, had been unlocked. The witness's timeline fit the CCTV. Mara's counter was methodical. She presented the clinic records, the ledger evidencing hush payments, the fingerprints inconsistent with direct handling of the knife. Then, the bomb. Her private investigator, an old friend named Kira, brought a USB, an audio recording of a private conversation between Eleanor and an unknown man. Mara played it in court with a trembling hand. It was Harker's voice, calm, measured, discussing a settlement of unpleasant elements and the need to remove a liability. He said, softly and plainly, "We do not allow poison in our garden." The courtroom hummed. Harker's face did not change. His eyes, however, searched Mara's with an anger that was pure, hot, paternal betrayal. He rose to object, to accuse, and Mara watched the man she had once idolized morph into a defendant of a different sort, the guardian of the city's curated wounds. But the audio was only part of it. The twist cut deeper. As the evidence unfurled, another truth came to light. Jonah had indeed been manipulated into the scene by Lennox, but Lennox was not a person. It was an operation code name for a group within the Mercy Foundation's security detail, run, as it happened, by a former detective who had once worked under Harker. When the security detail's motives were uncovered, a ledger within a safe deposit box revealed payments not to settlements, but to removals. The city's generosity had a back end, a system to exile or silence people who threatened donors or trustees. Eleanor, the philanthropic saint, was a midwife of disappearances. The knife, Harker's men claimed, had been used to leave a message. But who had wielded it? It is never simple in the way of movies. Mara began to see the contours of the choice before her. If she pushed for full transparency, exposing Harker would mean toppling the old scaffolding of power. The fallout would be catastrophic. Foundation-funded shelters would close. Thousands of innocents would suffer as funds evaporated. If she protected Harker, she protected the city's fragile architecture, the roofs over the poor, the hospitals that needed grants, the programs that saved lives. She asked herself a brutal question. Can the wrong be excused if its removal saves the greater number? Her moral compass, once unbending, wobbled, recalibrated by the consequence of exposure. The courtroom began to feel like a cathedral to hypocrisy. Public opinion, fueled by editorial op-eds and social feeds, demanded blood. Mara had built her career on the calculated decision, the right precedent. Now the precedent was a human weight, the old man who had taught her to read a court's silence and the young barrister who could be ruined by the press's first paragraph. The final twist arrived not in the courtroom but in Mara's office late at night. She found an envelope under her door, handwritten, heavy. Inside was the confession she had been waiting for, but not in the way she had imagined. It was from Eleanor's assistant, who had been with her for years. A tidy, trembling note that admitted to the killing. The assistant wrote that she had confronted Eleanor about the removals, that Eleanor had laughed, and when the assistant had tried to force a change, Eleanor had brandished the knife in a moment of terror. They struggled. The assistant's hand slipped. It was an accident, the note said. But then the assistant wrote something that arrested Mara's lungs. Harker told me to hide the truth. He said the city's good must be preserved. He said I would be taken care of. There was the hammer blow of decision. Mara now had a confession that would free Jonah and reveal Harker's orchestration. She had a choice. Bring the confession forward and see the Mercy Foundation crumble into honest pieces, or create a legal edifice to protect the vulnerable programs. To let the assistant serve a short term while a reform plan saved thousands. Truth versus consequences. Justice versus salvage. In the end, Mara did what she had never done before, and what she had always wanted to do. She broke the ledger and wrote with her own hand a different kind of law. In court, she placed the assistant's confession alongside the audio, the ledger, and the security payments. She argued for mercy, not for cover-up. Her words were measured, not theatrical. She exposed Harker with the surgical precision of a scalpel and, then, cruelly human, she asked for a sentencing that would not destroy the Mercy Foundation, but would force it to unravel and rebuild in the light. She proposed a restructure, a new board, independent oversight, and a public fund to replace the shadow payments. The city howled. Harker's empire shrank that week. He resigned with a dignity that felt like a farewell to a culture. Jonah, surprised and raw, was exonerated. His name wiped clean on paper, but not on tongues. The assistant pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received a sentence that mirrored the taking responsibility Mara demanded. The Mercy Foundation survived, not as it had been, but stitched into a new shape with fewer shadows. Mara walked out of the courthouse into the rain again. She felt the water on her face like absolution and like salt. The victory was not sweet. It tasted like iron. She had exposed corruption and forced the city to pay for its sins in public. She had protected programs, but she had also made sure that someone paid for the killing. She could not reconcile whether that balance was moral or merely pragmatic. She had chosen the lesser ruin, a compromise she would lie awake with for months. That night, in the quiet of her small apartment, Mara found the man, the one who had been framed years before, waiting at her door with a phone handful of letters. He had been quietly released after new evidence, and he came not for vengeance but to say simply, "I read your file. I know." They drank tea and did not speak of absolution. Instead, they spoke of systems and how they bend people until they break. He told her he forgave her in the only way he could, by asking her to keep doing what she did, but better. Mara kept working. She kept drafting motions and forming strategies, and she kept teaching herself how to hold truth gently without letting it obliterate the fragile good that remained. She learned that justice is not a single strike of a gavel, but a long, messy labor, an architecture built of tiny, necessary compromises and occasional, brave confrontations. In the months after the trial, when people asked her what had happened, she would sometimes answer with simplicity and sometimes with a shrug. "We cleaned a wound," she would say. but someone had to get hurt to patch it. The city hummed on. The Mercy Foundation changed its bylaws. Harker retired. Jonah opened a small bakery and learned how to make bread, not only artful lattes. The assistant served her sentence and later worked with a rehabilitation program funded by the new, transparent Mercy. Mara's name rose vaguely in the press. A lawyer who had cut a city clean and left scars that would heal. She kept the burned file of her old mistake in a drawer, not as a secret to be folded away, but as a reminder of the cost of silence. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain came down hard and the courthouse's black mirror called to her, she would take it out and let the paper smell of smoke. She would think of Harker's voice and Jonah's nervous hands and the assistant's trembling script. She would think of the ledger and the choices she had made and the ones she would make again, differently, if she could. Because for Mara Valen, law was not arithmetic at all. It was a ledger of lives, and every entry demanded accounting. Questions without easy estimates. Whom to save, whom to expose, which truth would build a better city, and which would burn it down. She had learned to live with the discomfort of imperfect answers. In that uncomfortable space, the city breathed on, flawed and alive. And so did she, messy, precise, and still learning how to be just.